One way of massively improving your formulas is to use named cells or named ranges, because this will make your formula easier to read, particularly as the formulas get bigger and longer and larger. And naming cells works across your workbook. So you could name a cell in sheet January, for example, as we have here, and reference it in December, and you don't need to tell Excel that that named cell is in January. It knows that from when you've defined the name. So let's take our sales data and look at how we would define a name or a range of cells. So here in our January sheet, if I were to highlight these values here, these are our North sales values. Now at the moment I can add those up by saying sum B3 to H3, count B3 to H3, find the lowest and the highest using that range B3 to H3. If I now give that range a name by highlighting the cells, go to formulas, and then I have the option here to either go into the name manager or define the name directly here, define name. Now notice how it picks up the nearest piece of text it can find, which is North. I'm just going to amend that slightly and call it North Sales. Now you will find that names cannot have spaces in them, and if we try to put a space in this name range, we will be told you cannot have spaces in them. We then need to define the scope for our name, and we can actually tell it to exist in the whole workbook. So North Sales would then refer to the cells I have highlighted, or we can say just exist in January, in which case North Sales would only exist in this sheet and I could not reference it in another sheet. Now having a named range that only exists in a single sheet is quite useful if you then want to copy that sheet and keep the same named range. If you try to copy a sheet with a named range that has a scope of the whole workbook, you'll be prompted to rename the range. However, I already have my sheets created and I would like to reference this range in another worksheet, so I'm going to set its scope as the workbook. Then have an option for comment, totally optional, you can add things in if you like. And then this is my range, January exclamation mark B3 to H3. Okay, so having named a range, how do I then use it? Well, I could add that range up by deleting my formula in there and replacing with equals sum, open brackets, and then I either have to remember the name of my range, or whilst I'm at the open bracket stage, I can come up to the formula ribbon, and in the name section we have here use in formula, click the drop down and I can see North Sales. One click and it places the name of the range in my formula, which I can then just return, and we see that it gives us the same result, 5114. The formula reads equals sum North Sales. The real power of named ranges comes on different sheets. If I add a new sheet and say in here equals sum open brackets North Sales, notice that as you start typing, it's giving me options. If I go back a couple of letters, it's giving me options of some other functions, but also my named ranges. I can see it there in the list, North Sales, so I can double click to choose and return, and I get the same result, 5114. No need to reference the sheet or the cells or the range, it simply uses the named range to tell it where to get those cells from, which happen to be over here in January. So I can do the same for the South. Highlight those, create a named range, and then change the function to use it. Now, having said that, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to show you a really quick way in Excel for it to create the named ranges for you, particularly when you have a table like this. First thing I want to do though is delete the named range I already have. To do that, we go to the name manager. There's my named range and we can simply delete. Are you sure? I am. It's gone. What I then do instead, notice here my formula is now fallen apart because the named range doesn't exist, so let's just drag that one up over it. Bill without formatting. And now we're going to highlight our numbers, but not the totals. Also, the labels, column labels and these row labels. Then go to Create from Selection. It's asking me where are the names that I would like to use as the named range labels. Are they in the top row, left column, bottom row, right column. Notice how it's already pre-ticked top row and left column because it's spotted this text here and this text here. Thank you, please go ahead. Okay. What we then have, if we go to the name manager, is a separate named range for each of my columns and each of my rows. So I've got east, north, south and west on my 4 rows. Speedboats, planes, horses, helicopters, cars and caravans on my 6 columns. You'll also notice that although my labels had spaces in, those spaces have been replaced with underscores because I mentioned earlier the named range cannot have a space. These now all exist, separate named ranges. I didn't have to create each one separately, but I can then use them. Equals average, open brackets. Now I'm after the car sold, so I can either go use in formula and choose from the list, car sold, done. Let's do the next one a slightly different way, which is equals average, open brackets, and then I'm going to start typing the name, which is plain sold, P-L-A, and you can see there's the named range appearing, so I can then simply double click, choose that and return, and I get my result. So it's a clever use of names, either in Excel to create the named ranges for you, or even creating the named ranges yourself and then using them across the sheets of a workbook. Now you'll see that as we go through the rest of this title, we're going to use named ranges a lot in our formulas to make them easier to read and easier to follow and hopefully easier to use.